So my name is Tham Nguyen. I'm the Senior Director in the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. So it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists who will be here for this session on the cost of street space, congestion curb, and lane pricing. So as Phil mentioned, how precious real estate is in this on our roadways, where this space is becoming very precious and finite. How do we balance all of the uses for it? And so our panelists here will be talking in more depth about that. And so to my left is Heather Thompson, CEO of ITDP. Next to her is Michael Manville, professor at UCLA. And then Christina Calderato, Head of Delivery Planning at Transport for London. And then next to her is Donald Shoup, author of The High Cost of Free Parking and professor at UCLA. And so one of the things that we talk about in terms of our panel is how do we balance that supply and demand for finite resources. And another way of thinking about it in terms of supply and demand, actually, you may be very familiar with how to use market pricing already through some of the things that happen in your own life, such as going to happy hour, for example, because that is market pricing at work, right? So when the demand is low, restaurants try to draw you in by lowering the price for food and beer and whatever other beverage it may be. And when demand is high, they charge you a lot more for it, right? So you sort of have a sense of how supply and demand works in some sense with that. And so as our roadways become more congested and we run out of low-hanging fruits for how do we improve, there's only so much roadway widening that can be done. There's only so much that we can build out. But as we become more congested, as there's more demand for that roadway space, population continues to grow, and there's more travel demand, those low-hanging fruits we're running out of them. And so cities in the United States are exploring curb and congestion pricing to balance supply and demand on this finite roadway space. What are the trade-offs that cities, communities, and the public need to consider to ensure that cities remain livable and that the space is appropriately shared? So I'm going to throw it over to my panelists to see who wants to answer that first question. I'll actually start with Heather, actually.
Okay. Well, I love the idea of curbside and pricing being associated with happy hour. I think that's a great place to start. But I would argue that actually pricing is a low-hanging fruit. It's one of the things that really is an opportunity ahead of us that we haven't taken advantage of. We know that we need more space, we need more money for our systems, we need to discourage single occupancy vehicles that are leading to congestion and pollution and time wasted, money wasted. So it really is something that we need to address. And this idea that roads and space is free is false. It's not free. It's causing all of these problems with pollution and time wasted. And it's a classic tragedy of the common situation where a decision that makes sense for one person is leading to a situation that really is making everybody worse. If we think about our road space and having so many single occupancy vehicles, we should be using the space much more smartly for transit, for walking, for cycling, dedicating the space for a lot more throughput of people. And the question of trade-offs, I think the trade-offs are really political and temporary. It requires a cultural shift, and by pricing these assets that we have, it really causes that sort of behavioral shift and cultural shift that we need.
And Michael, do you want to add anything?
Oh, no, I would agree with that 100%, especially the part that that we're sort of just getting around to the idea of pricing this space and not thinking of it as the low-hanging fruit really suggests how exalted automobiles are in our minds. Because if you think of almost any other commodity, if you were constantly running out of it, even something like really related to cars, like imagine you owned a gas station and you gave all the gas away for free every day. And then like at the end of the day you were out of gas and you were talking to your friends and you just said, well, maybe I should buy a bigger gas station, or maybe I should invent a better type of gasoline that like the gas fills itself up in the car. Probably whoever you were talking to would just say, well, why don't you just charge for it, right? And we don't do that. It's like the last thing we think of with cars, but for everything else, it's the first thing we think of. And so it's good that we're getting around to this, because it's great to have technological improvement, and it's great to see all these things on the horizon, but something we could literally do tomorrow would be just charge the right price for this space.
Well, traffic is choking our city, so it causes congestion, it costs our economies, it causes air pollution, it worsens our health. And so we can either continue to keep trading those things off in order to keep car travel cheap and convenient, or we can think about the way that we more appropriately price car use, which means that actually you get a behavior change, you free up road space, that gives you the space to create better alternatives, and it creates the revenues to help you fund those alternatives. So I think when we're looking at trade-offs, we're already making trade-offs. It's do we want to shift that balance so that we are making better choices?
Parked cars have colonized city streets for so long that most people think the cars own the curb lanes. But there's a lot of competition for that curb nowadays. That Amazon has created a much greater demand for loading zones, and Uber and Lyft have created much more demand for passenger drop-off zones, and traffic congestion leads to the demand for dedicated bus lanes. So I think we should use the lane in the most productive uses. The question is, how do you measure the productivity? I think one example I like from New York is that whenever they take parking spaces away from curb parking for a bike station, people say that this parking is priceless. You're taking away our parking. Well, one guy took a video of two sides of Broadway in Manhattan and ran it for an hour and showed what was speeded up and showed what was happening. And that in that hour, 200 people arrived and left from the bus station, from the bike station, and 11 people got in and out of the parked cars. So I think you'd say that the curb parking for the bike station was more productive than for parked cars. So I think one of the things we should look at is how you can optimize the productivity of the curb. And I think that one study at UCLA, a master's thesis, looked at how Santa Monica Boulevard in Hollywood worked. And he looked at Uber and Lyft, and it turned out that the Uber and Lyft passengers had to get in and out of the car in traffic 50% of the time. Because all the curb was occupied. That's dangerous, it's inconvenient. The Uber and Lyft are double parked, so it slowed traffic. I think we should learn how to shift land from curb parking into these other more productive uses, and one of the ways to do it is through pricing. Supply and demand. The law doesn't go away because you're dealing with curb parking. It's actually very simple because the supply is fixed. There's only so much of it. So you just have to manage demand, and one of the ways to manage demand is with prices. And some cities have started doing this for parking, just charge the lowest price you could charge, and still leave one or two open spaces available for new arrivals. The curb is priced to make it well used. Almost all the spaces are occupied, but readily available because there are one or two open spaces. And I think if we extend that idea to all uses of the curb, we'd be much better off. It would turn out, if the price is high for curb parking, maybe the space should be used for shared cars, because shared cars can serve many more people than one privately owned cars. And you could extend this to other uses of the curb. So I think, it's like the other said, we should let prices guide the planning and tell us where we should shift from curb parking to dedicated bus lanes or outdoor cafes or Uber and Lyft pickup and drop-offs. Yes, I think that if we should let prices guide the planning.
And Don, that's a great segue, because ultimately I think what Don is mentioning that's really important is, what is the ultimate desired outcome of what we're trying to achieve with using a pricing strategy to be able to make the best and highest, maximize the productivity of that space? And I know that with the work that Heather's been doing across the world, there are probably other places where cities are utilizing this as a way to be able to maximize that productivity and just improve that desired and achieve that desired outcome. Do you want to talk more about that?
Sure. We are having more and more success around the world with, as we call it, off-street parking. One example I wanted to bring up is from the city, Mexico City. It's a city that's kind of similar to LA in many ways. And some years ago, they instituted a parking strategy that they called Eco Park. It was done in partnership with the police department, because enforcement was a major issue. So they really brought the police department on board from the very beginning. In just one neighborhood, I was looking up some statistics to share with you all. In just one neighborhood, when they started to limit and price the parking, parking went from 130%, yes, that's more than 100%, because many people were double parked, which of course was causing more congestion, more safety issues. So it went from 130% to 80%. And with that, cruising time to find a spot went from 13 minutes to 3 minutes. So a real huge reduction in cruising time. And if you add that up in terms of hours over a year, it's more than 6 million hours a year of time savings. And just one sense, I know we all are increasingly concerned with climate change. That translates to 18,000 tons of CO2 savings per year. So that's just the work that we've done on-street parking. I think it's important, though, to keep in mind that I think a lot of people think, oh, well, the answer is we'll just shift parking to parking in buildings and parking structures. That's not really the answer either, because ultimately we're trying to change behavior and control cars. So again, a great example from Mexico City. Just a couple of years ago, we worked really closely with the real estate development community to understand what they wanted to do with parking. And there were minimum parking requirements in building codes, which basically forced them to build more parking than they wanted. They rather have that space go to commercial or real estate uses. It's much more financially lucrative to them. So what we did was change those minimums to maximums. So it basically allowed the real estate development community to choose how much parking they wanted to create. And we're now doing an evaluation of that policy that was implemented in 2017. And what we're seeing is, on average, they're building 20% less parking places. So again, if you translate that to climate savings in terms of the number of cars that you're avoiding on the road, that will translate to 2.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent savings by 2030. So, it's about getting the incentives right, but keeping in mind that we don't want to just push the problem over somewhere else. We're really looking for that pricing to lead to behavior changes.
Yeah, and so, as I'm borrowing from Michael Manville, when I say the next thing, which is, in addition to pricing the curb, congestion pricing is, would you say, the cousin of parking, of pricing the parking area and the curb. And so with that, the concept of congestion pricing has been implemented in a number of different cities around the world, from Milan to Stockholm, London to Singapore. And when those concepts are initially discussed, there's a lot of public opposition to it. It's an emotional topic when you talk about people's travel, and then you layer on pricing and all of those other conversations. So you can imagine those are very robust conversations. And with that, how do you, we know that it works in the places where it's been implemented throughout the world. In the United States, places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, New York are now thinking about how do we employ that as a mechanism to address supply and demand on our roadway space. And so to overcome that public opposition, to get public buy-in, to even try that concept is something that I think one of our panelists has a lot of experience. And so Christina, you want to talk more about how do you build that initial political support to even try out that concept, and what has been the outcome?
Yes, it's actually really easy, so you should all give it a try. It's not really easy, and what you have to do is not start by trying to answer the question, how do we build support for road pricing? So it's much more important to get agreement around a problem. So in 2003, when we introduced the congestion charge in central London, it was widely, uniformly agreed that congestion was now a significant problem that everybody wanted to solve, and therefore there was agreement that we were looking for a solution. And then you can move the conversation onto what does that solution need to be, and you need to do that in consultation with people. And we spent a long time consulting, looking what different models could be, tweaking your designs as you go, making sure you are aware of the impacts, mitigating the impacts. But having that agreement about the objectives and the outcomes you're seeking to achieve is really key. We've just, earlier this year, launched the ultra-low emission zone in central London. The basis for that was completely different, and that was about air quality. And again, by the time we'd got to implementing that scheme, there was widespread public support for the idea that the level of air quality in our city was not acceptable, the impacts on our health and on the health of future generations was not acceptable. And then again, you get to coalescing around an idea for support. And then it's about being really clear about the objectives, the outcomes, how you will spend any revenues, and in the London schemes, they're all hypothecated to reinvest into transport. And then, once you've done that, you need to hold your nerve. And I think understand that you're not going to win everybody over. You're not going to be able to bring everybody around to support before you implement a scheme. So you bring people with you, and then you hold your nerve and you implement. You do what you said you were going to do, and you wait for the benefits to start happening. And as you've said, it's worked. So with the congestion charge zone, we saw a decrease in traffic of 15%, decrease in congestion of 30%. In the 6 months since the ultra-low emission zone has been in, we've seen reductions in roadside nitrogen dioxide of 30%. And so once you see those benefits coming, once people can see, this is why you said you were doing it, this was the outcomes you said we were going to achieve, we're starting to see those and feel those benefits, then it becomes much more difficult for people to want to undo those benefits, and you start moving forward in that cycle of public acceptability. People become used to it, and actually they don't want to give up the benefits that they achieve. So be brave, hold your nerve.
And Michael, is there anything you want to add to that?
That all makes sense to me. I guess the only thing that I would consider is just that, like in a place like Los Angeles, obviously we have bad congestion and bad air quality, just like London, but in most other ways we don't look much like London. And the big difference for our purposes is just that so many of our residents own cars. Right, automobile ownership in London is relatively low compared to Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken. And so more people in LA would look at a program like this and imagine they would pay, right? And that would change the equation a little bit. And I think that, and I know you don't particularly like this talking point, but I think one thing that we have to say to people is that, yes, this would reduce emissions, and yes, this would shrink the total footprint of our transportation system if we had congestion pricing, but also it would make driving so much better. Right, if you have a region full of drivers, it's really important to frame congestion pricing as a policy that is good for drivers. Because right now, to use a technical term, our road system sucks, right? We have failed for decades to give drivers a good system. And if you price the roads and you get rid of congestion or you reduce it by 30%, yeah, you're paying, but in exchange for paying, you're actually getting better driving. And I think when you have a place where 90% of the households own a car, you can't leave that part out, right? I mean, so what congestion pricing does, and it really is a win-win, is it shrinks the total amount of driving we have, but it makes that driving a much better quality too.
Yeah, I think when we were preparing for the call, he used the word pro pro-car. I was like, I don't know if that's really what we're going for is pro-car. I'd like to say pro-mobility, where car is part of the solution, but there are many others. And again, you know, taking more space away for other forms of transportation is part of the mix. But I understand Los Angelinos like their cars, so we need to speak the terms that are going to resonate with them. So.
And so ultimately, it's about how do you get more people within move more people within this very finite space. And so ultimately, it's about pro-mobility, as you both described. And so with that, one of the main concerns with congestion pricing is this idea of fairness, about how are low-income populations going to be affected by any sort of congestion pricing scheme. And so how can congestion pricing strategies mitigate these concerns and the impacts to these low-income populations? I'll throw it over to Christina first.
Well, I think the first thing to mention, and really important in messaging, is that people in low-income households usually disproportionately disbenefit from the impacts of congestion. So they usually live by busier roads, they have higher severance, they suffer the worst air quality, they have the poorest health outcomes, so they also stand to benefit the most from these schemes. And I think it's really important not to lose this in the round, that it's not just about the cost of the driving, although that's part of it, but there are other benefits that they will receive from the implementation of a scheme like that. When we develop our policies and proposals around this, we do equality impact assessments, and they identify all the impacts, positive and negative, across different groups and identify mitigations. So in central London, it's a very, very small area that has a particular makeup of traffic. But in 2021, we are going to expand the ultra-low emission zone to the whole of inner London, which is 18 times the size of the original zone. Brings in a lot more people, a lot of different types of people and different types of trips. And we have identified through that equality impact assessment that there will be an impact on low-income households who perhaps can't make a different choice. And so one of the ways we've sought to mitigate that is we've just launched a car and motorcycle scrappage scheme, which is targeted at low-income households on some form of income benefits or mobility-related benefits. And if they want to scrap a polluting vehicle, will get a payment that can either go towards a cleaner vehicle if they are reliant on a vehicle, recognizing that some people will be, or we put together a kind of mobility package where actually they can make that money go further by having negotiated deals with car clubs and giving them free cycle hire. So we're constantly trying to think of ways that we can mitigate impacts on low-income households while still helping them to make more sustainable choices.
Michael, do you want to add something to that?
No, I think that was, I mean, I agree with all of that. I guess the only thing I'd add is just to remember that the status quo that we have in many ways isn't terribly fair. There's, I mean, when we think about helping low-income people, we often think about some form of sort of progressive redistribution where we take money from affluent people and give it to low-income people. Leaving the curb or the road free does not fit that bill, right? And if you leave the road space free, it looks much more like a matching grant, where it says, like, well, if you have the money to buy yourself a car, right, then we're going to give you this nice benefit, which is free use of our roads or free use of a curb. But not everyone has the money to buy a car, right? And it's a strange system where if I spend $15,000 on a car, the city of Los Angeles says, oh, well, you can store it for free on our land, right? But if I take that $15,000 and give it to Oxfam or something, the city gives me nothing, right? So if we really want to help low-income people, and make sure they're not harmed by a pricing program, like we have a model for doing that for all the other things that we price, like our electric utilities and our gas utilities and on and on and on, and just take some of that money, identify people who might be harmed, and give it to them. Right? Like this is how our food stamp program works. Nobody thinks that the solution to hunger is to make all food free for everybody in the United States, right? But when we talk about pricing roads, we say that the only solution to equity in driving is to make all roads free for everybody. That's neither fair nor efficient.
And so, although congestion pricing and curb pricing are addressing different aspects of the transportation system, they're pretty interrelated, as hopefully you're getting out of this conversation. So they help to manage the supply and demand side for our finite roadway spaces. From a global perspective, you know, when we talk about places like London or Singapore, people in LA or the local area think, well, yeah, but it's London and Singapore. How does it apply here? And so you've mentioned some examples of how those strategies can be used in the local context. And I would throw it to the panelists to put it in the context of what are the lessons learned that can be applied locally. And I'll start with Heather.
So, you know, I think really cities need to look at their local situation. LA needs to look at their local situation and think about what pricing strategies make the most sense. And I think congestion pricing is something we're seeing more and more cities try, like New York City, where I now live. After 10 years of debating it, they're moving forward. And the big reason for that was because so many people do depend on the public transportation system, the subway system, and the subway systems are failing. And so there's a need for a lot more money to go into the systems. And so the congestion pricing has gone through with that promise of raising more money for the system, and really looking to London as an example for that. So I applaud all of that. I do want to come back to this idea of parking, though, because as we've talked about, congestion pricing is difficult. It's really hard to get it right. It's politically fraught. There's equity issues. There's enforcement issues. Whereas parking is something that is much easier to do. Congestion pricing also, in order to do it, sometimes you need agreement from the city and the state to allow the policy to go through, like we saw in New York City. Whereas parking is actually already in the jurisdiction of cities. You can do it street by street, corner by corner. It's a lot easier to get done and can have a similar result. It's also something when you consider the equity issues where you can take the money from pricing parking and put it right back into that local community so that community sees the benefits and the equity issues are less. So you can create a nice pocket park on the corner for a neighborhood. You can clean up the streets, actually cleaning them, planting trees. So something that the community really sees beyond just the limiting of the parking and pricing the parking. So I really encourage people to, again, realize that super low-hanging fruit that's on offer.
And I would throw it to Don as well, who has spent a lot of his career talking about parking and pricing the curb.
Well, yes. I confess I drove here today, and I didn't park in the gigantic parking structure right next to this tent, but I parked 2 blocks away in a parking lot for $5. And as I walked here, I saw the most, not mismanaged curb parking, but it was just unmanaged. Nothing was charged for. There were no rules that cars were parked perpendicular to the sidewalk. It was a complete mess. And I think if we get the price of curb parking, the curb use right, it'll have a cascade of benefits for society. You wouldn't have to build these gigantic pharaonic parking structures to avoid making the curb parking worse. I think that we would have good guides on what is the best use of the curb, whether changing some parking spaces to loading zone would generate more revenue because you could charge the trucks by the minute for it. They're not at the curb for very long, so they could pay a high price per minute, but they have to have available space when they arrive. So the spaces would be less fully used or occupied every minute of the hour, but they would generate more revenue and they could bid the land away from curb parking. Now, I think politically the objections that you often hear is that this will hurt poor people who now park free at the curb. And most people who do park at the curb do park free. For example, in New York, 97% of all the curb parking is free. It's 3 million free parking spaces, equal to 17 central parks. It's worth a lot of money. So I think if you did say we're going to allocate the curb to the highest bidder, the use that will yield the most revenue, maybe as a restaurant or as a bus lane, then you could deal with the equity question with affluence testing, the way we do for other public services like gas and electricity and water. If you're low income, you pay a lower price. So you can't say this is really harming low-income people because they're getting a big discount. If you do that, you'll have to charge a high price for everyone else because there's only a fixed supply. And I think that too often that we get objections to pricing the curb, saying this will hurt the poor. But I think really some people just push poor people out in front of them like human shields, saying don't charge for this because it'll hurt the poor. But really, they don't want to pay for it. I think most really poor people don't own a car. So they would get nothing but services. And certainly in New York, the proposal is to start charging $5.50 a day on average for all this free curb parking space. And it would pay for free public transit for everybody in New York. And $5.50 a day is now the price of one round trip on the subway. So it's not really charging too much, but there's so much of it that it would generate a lot of revenue if we begin thinking of this as land that has to be better managed. And there's no worse managed land on the planet than the roads, including the curbs.
So I also wanted to make sure that we leave some room for Q&A with the audience. And so I see a hand up there. So do we have a mic somewhere? Oh.
As well as in the town. One of our town's problem is when we implement that strategy, the nearest neighbors in their streets become the problem. So how do you guys mitigate removing congestion where it needs to be removed and not adding congestion where it previously wasn't right next door?
So I can pick that up from a central London perspective. I think it's a really important point, actually, and it's not something we talk about all the time. But when you're trying to identify a zone, you need to be really careful about identifying the right boundary to the zone. So first of all, you need to try and find something which means that people can avoid it if they want to or need to. And that means that they need to be able to exit those roads without causing rat running, which gives you adverse impacts around a boundary. So a lot of that is just about looking at your area and the types of roads that they are, the types of traffic it's carrying, where are the strategic routes, where will traffic move around otherwise, and then it's working with those boroughs. So one of the things that we did when we put in the central London scheme was we gave money to the local authorities around it, and they used that money to put in control parking zones so that we didn't have an effect where people drifted in, parked around that boundary, and those neighbourhoods suffered the disbenefits. So it's by working with those communities, looking at your area, understanding the types of trip. But yeah, it's an important issue to deal with.
Yeah, and I would add, New York is considering the same. For those of you that know New York City, it's basically a cordon-based approach where everything south of 60th is going to be part of the congestion zone. And so those that are right on that line on the west side are very concerned about congestion and parking. And so now they're considering parking management and parking pricing, which is a great reaction that the local community board is actually advocating for some parking management. So hopefully that will be the beginning of really understanding in New York City what the parking can do. So I think it's a combination of putting these tools together to cover the basis.
Yes. The problem you mentioned is already happening because of Waze. Waze is sending people to side streets because the main streets are congested. So it isn't something new that congestion pricing would cause. I think congestion pricing would relieve it, because if it made Olympic and Pico and every other main street work the way they should, there would be no need for Waze to send you through residential neighborhoods.
So
Thank you. This is my favorite stuff. The first thing I would just put out there, you talked earlier about internalizing the costs of motor vehicles, which is absolutely integral to this. We do need to put this in the car, and I would encourage travelometer, so we can marry policy with the utilization of the vehicle to get the outcomes that we need. But the thing that I just got so stressed out about, because I'm, a member of the Church of Shoup, and is the notion on-street versus off-street parking. So I've always viewed off-street parking as, street parking is theft, street parking is murder. As a cyclist, this is the stuff that is actually killing me or about to kill my fellow cyclists, because we should have that as a lane. So when I hear about, well, like that street parking is okay, why can't we just have it all as off-street parking and never have on-street parking again? Is that possible?
Well, it's a long way from here to there. And I think what is the next step? And I think that there's some wonderful next steps that Los Angeles could take. Other cities have bicycle boulevards. It isn't just a parking lane in the main street. They take whole long stretches of street and divert cars off at every couple of blocks, and the bicycles could go all the way through. So I think that if we did begin charging for parking, we would probably find that many roads would be better used for bicycle boulevards. But I think that at least if you started charging for parking, you'd see how much it would cost to dedicate land to a bike lane. And often it would be extremely low, because parking isn't worth that much. And I think many European cities have what they call parking protected bicycle lanes, when you use the parking to protect the cars, shifting the parking out into the street and having the bike lane between the parked cars and the curb. So I think that if we're going to have no cars, it would be like many wonderful European central cities. I'd never been to Spain before this summer, and I went to Malaga, and I was amazed that the streets are paved with marble from storefront to storefront, and there are no cars. So I think that, yes, that if we begin bringing parking into the market, we'll find that there are a lot better uses for this very valuable land than parked cars.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm also a cyclist, and I think that the proper mix of on and off street parking is related to, but sort of distinct from, like, how we decide to protect our bicyclists, right? I mean, we just have to affirmatively decide we want to protect cyclists, and then how we sort of allocate the mix of parking becomes a separate question. And one thing I'm thinking of is, could we have a situation where there really was no street parking and it was all off-street? In Los Angeles, we do. It's Century City. Century City is not a multimodal paradise. My doctor's office used to be over there, and I used to bike down it, and it was terrifying. And I think we shouldn't understate, too, that when you do have a lot of off-street parking, it means you have a lot of curb cuts. And curb cuts are also super dangerous for cyclists, because people tend to come out of driveways at about 40 miles an hour. And so I think that what we need is, I mean, there's a spot for this ground floor of real estate parking, which is your curb, where you want people to be there for 5 or 10 minutes. And then there's off-street parking, where you want people who are going to be there for longer. And then, of course, we just kind of want people to drive a little bit less in general. But overlaying on top of that is just like, we should have facilities that protect bicyclists, right? And we can design our parking in ways that doesn't conflict with that, and we should. We don't do it very much in LA, but we should.
Yeah, and I just want to add and sort of reiterate a point I made earlier. I mean, when we're talking about pricing or the use of curb space, we're really trying to get to two things. One is a more efficient use of the space, but the other is to discourage driving by making it more difficult. So we don't want to just shift the problem over to the off-street parking and make ample off-street parking, because then we're not actually changing the behavior by making driving more difficult. So we need to think about both of those goals in tandem.
So I see a hand over there. Oh, there's no more. Okay, I guess that's it.
Oh, we're done?
So we're done. So please join me in giving the panelists a round of applause.